They hauled a man up the gangway, wet rope cutting into his wrists, and Captain Marlowe pointed with a brass spyglass before anyone could speak. Fear tightened Elias' hands around the ledger in his pocket. He counted breaths instead of names. The captain said, "One goes tonight." A prisoner cried out. Someone shoved the man forward and the crew laughed like a practiced bell. Within those first moments, Elias understood the ship's rule. Erase the inconvenient and call it order. Elias slid back against the wet rail, nails tasting salt. Not because he did not know Marlowe's voice, but because the man's tone made the policy sound like a ledger entry. He had come aboard with tradesman's marks and a merchant's memory. On the deck, he kept his ledger folded small and hidden. Thomas had shown him that fold in the bilge, tapping the damp wood where Elias would push the book out of sight. Thomas, names are a thing they cannot burn if you hide them right. Elias nodded and priced the risk in heartbeats. They tied the man to the plank and the boatswain, Graves, hammered the peg in with a practiced swing. Boatswain Graves. Elias whispered in a voice he forced small. Like a stone under water, remember his face. Thomas squeezed his shoulder and did not meet Elias' eyes. The captain circled, counting off names like cargo. 1, 2, 3. Elias' fear sharpened into a decision that tightened his jaw. He would not let those names vanish on paper and at sea. After the public punishment, the crew moved like officials filing a report. Quartermaster Hale took the sealed roll call from Marlowe and tucked it into a crate labeled salted beef. Seal it, Marlowe, no dock. No questions, Hale clicked his tongue, and his hands moved with the calm of a man who had handled deadman's goods before. Elias watched Hale's fingers, memorized the seal, then slipped down the wheeled hatch to the bilge where the ledger waited under a rotted plank. Below, the bilge smelled of old rope, tar and vinegar. Elias flattened his palms on cold wood and wrote in a cramped hand, name mark, brief note. The ledger's pages stuck together. The ink ran in places from damp, but it held. Thomas lifted a lantern and said, "If they find this, they cut us loose from claim to the world, Elias. Then they will have to decide who owns the truth." Thomas' voice was small but sharp. The two men worked in silence until a scuff above deck sent a thin flare of panic through the hold. Boots passed near their hatch and both froze. They returned to a deck where Marlowe appointed punishments like an administrator crossing out debtors. Elias kept his distance, watching how Marlowe spoke to Quartermaster Hale. Low, precise as if dictating to a clerk. Hale, Marlowe, make the transfer sealed and add a note. Transferred under captain's order. No signatures. No harbor logs, Hale replied. Captain Marlowe. Graves barked a roll call and names slid from the manifest onto a separate list that only Marlowe saw. Elias' suspicion grew. He had thought it cruelty, but he now saw the mechanics, a bureaucratic erasure that left no trace. That night below deck, the crew forced prisoners into ritualized humiliation to break them into silence. A guard shoved a man forward and ordered him to kneel on wet planks while others spat at his boots. Elias moved to cover a wounded man's face with a scrap of linen, trying to protect him from the way the guard's laugh would strip dignity. "Stop that," the guard said, and Elias froze. The guard's boot leaned across Elias' foot before Thomas shoved his shoulder into a nearby crate to draw the guard away. "Thomas." Elias hissed. Thomas' breath came shallow but steady. A clash of intent passed between them. Thomas' quick deflection, Elias' tight jaw, and the guard left, muttering curses. Elias later pried a damp manifest from a crate and compared it with his ledger beneath the crate's lid. Inked out lines, false totals, and margins annotated in Marlowe's hand proved a system. Names removed and replaced with blanks. Elias fingered a fresh blot of black where a name had been scrubbed. His hands trembled and his throat kept a tight sound. He set the manifest beside the ledger and ran a finger along both documents as one would read a wound. Boatswain Graves smelled the paper before Elias could fold it away. Graves stepped into the alcove and grabbed Elias' arm, hauling him beneath the foremast. "What have you got there?" Graves close, spit on Elias's cheek. Elias shoved his free hand into his shirt and felt for the ledger's edge. Nothing that matters to you, Elias. Graves laughed, "Don't lie. Thomas, you see him hiding things." Thomas hung back, eyes flicking to the crate. "Thomas says it's nothing. Graves, Elias." Graves pressed his forehead into Elias's and hissed, "You will trade me a name." Elias swallowed and thought of Thomas's thin ribs and the bruises along the other's ankle. Graves tightened his grip. Elias' voice cracked as he bargained, "If you let me keep it, I'll tell Marlowe where the rats are nesting in the hold." Graves spat and shoved Elias back. He stared at the manifest and then at Elias' hands. "Bring it up. Bring it now." Elias felt fear shift into a cold, careful anger. He rose because the ledger could not stay hidden if Graves suspected. He rose because Thomas's fingers had curled into his sleeve and would let the ledger go if ordered. They marched toward the stern beneath a single crackling lantern. Marlowe stood with his coat open, the spyglass dangling like a blade. Elias stepped before him while Graves barked. He had papers. "Captain," Marlowe's eyes flicked to the manifest, and then to the ledger held at Elias' hip. Elias drew the ledger out, flat and readable, and thrust it forward like a piece of contraband. "Captain Marlowe, Elias, look at the manifest. Look at what you call transfers." Marlowe took the book with a steady hand and did not pause. "You carry papers like complaints, Marlowe. You make trouble like folk who love noise." Thomas whispered, "Elias, don't make this worse." Elias' breath came short. A gust slammed rain into their faces, and the sea beat like a slow fist. Marlowe opened the ledger and looked at handwriting he had learned to ignore. He hurled a line across a name with his thumb, ink smearing. "You think paper binds me?" He asked, "Bring him out." Graves seized Elias, and Hale moved forward with a coil of rope. A circle of crew closed in quick practice. Elias' hands hammered against the grip on his ledger, and he called, "You cannot hide names forever." Thomas lunged, a small, sudden move to block Graves' arm, and Graves knocked him down with a shoulder. Thomas' breath left him. A wet sound in the wood. Elias snapped to action, ripping the ledger toward the lantern light so the pages showed. "Read those entries." Elias shouted at Marlowe, "Read who you sent. Read who you claim you moved." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "Quartermaster Hale." Marlowe, voice flat, "Make the selection." "One more man for the plank." Hale nodded and gave an order. The crew obeyed the old routine as if it were prayer. Graves shoved Elias to the deck and stamped, and Hale unrolled a list in his hand and read a name aloud. Elias leapt up and grabbed Hale's sleeve. "Hale, stop. Read the blot." "You altered this yourself." Hale's hand went to the seal at his waist. "Elias." Hale, low and urgent, "You press me when I have to keep my place." Elias kept hold of Hale's cuff and looked into the quartermaster's eyes. "Hale, Elias, do you remember Aldo from Portsmouth?" Hale's face flinched, and he said nothing. Thomas tried to speak, but Graves crushed his words with a knee. Around them men shouted names, and the selection rattled into a frenzy. In that moment Elias saw the crew split. Some faces showed thoughtless obedience. Others, like Hale's, tightened into an inner argument. Marlowe watched Hale with the serenity of a man measuring a ledger's edge. "If you make a fuss, Elias, you make more names. You force the method to sharpen." Elias's mouth was dry. He felt an emotion twist in him, from dread to a raw, brittle clarity that he had never wanted a fight, but had to hold proof. Thomas' hand found Elias's and squeezed. "You will not let them do it without a mark, Thomas." The crew dragged a man to the plank. Elias flung himself into the space between the prisoner and the lantern. "Stop," he cried. "Stop this, Red!" "These are names you took off your manifest." Graves struck Elias with the flat of his hand. "Quiet." Elias fell to one knee and shoved the ledger at Marlowe's feet. "Read it yourself." Marlowe looked at the pages and then at Elias. He could have crushed the ledger under his boot. Instead, he laughed in a way that split the rain. "You think a book saves them." "Marlowe, bring him." The crew hauled Elias upright. Men around them tightened into ropes and fists. The ledger slipped from Elias' hands during the scuffle, and a page flew into the lantern's glow. A line of names showed, inked dark and cramped. For a second, several men read aloud under forced breaths. "Here," someone murmured, "this one." Graves reached to grab the page, and a hand knocked the lantern. It tottered, oil spilling like a small, burning wound. Men shouted, boots slid. Thomas Dove and the lantern crashed against the rail and went out, leaving a circle of dark punctured by rain. In that blackout, Elias heard only the ship, a single, swollen heartbeat of wood and water. He felt fingers dig into his shoulder, heard Hale say in a close, quick hiss, "This is bad, Marlowe. This ledger moves too much air." Then quiet the air, Marlowe, quiet the ledger. Graves jabbed Elias with a knife's hilt and shouted for order, "Take him below. Show him what happens to those who make lists." The crew obeyed. Elias felt hands travel over his back like cataloging. Thomas slipped him a small carved bone token and mouthed, "Remember." Elias bit his cheek to keep from crying out. Below deck, they stripped Elias of his wet shirt and tied him to a remaining plank near the hold where the others slept in rows. They lashed his wrists where rope had already left scars. He heard Marlowe above in a slow step that measured the deck. The captain spoke to Graves, but Elias could not hear their words. The vibrations of boots and the sea commanded the space. He tried to move his fingers and they trembled. A prisoner 2 bunks over whispered, "You held a book. You made them look." Elias answered only with a short bark of breath. His fear shifted again, this time into a hollowed, careful patience. Keep the ledger safe in the small work his body still had left. When dawn bled into the seams of the planks, Elias found a moment to drag his chin toward the ledger hidden under a loose board at his feet. He lifted and felt the ledger's edge, pages damp but whole. Thomas had not been brought back. A silence moved through the hold that was not peace but a measure. Elias pulled the ledger into his lap and read the names again, each one now a tool. He folded a page carefully and slid it inside the hollow of a broken shackle nearby, forcing the metal around the paper so it would not be seen at a glance. Elias' hands shook as he worked. He heard a step on the hatch and then Graves's voice. He moved. Graves felt the shackle and spat, "You'll have to be cleverer than that." Elias swallowed and held his face still. He tugged a small string of beads from his shirt and braided it around the shackle, tying a knot he could work loose later. The knot took him 3 tries and his fingers cramped. He heard a voice from the deck. "Captain, the list has a new blot." Marlowe's reply was low and distant. "We will make one more transfer tonight. Make ready." When Elias crawled back up to the deck at dawn, he found the man who had been tied to the plank missing, and a length of rope coiled on the rail instead. The crew moved like people who had rehearsed grief into order. Elias reached under his shirt and felt the ledger's edge, where the shackle pressed into his ribs. He had traded pain for secrecy and the ledger for memory. Men looked at him and then away. Thomas did not stand on the rail. Elias stepped to the bilge and set the ledger against the damp wood, scenting tar and salt. The ledger would not stop the next transfer, but it had the power to prove it. He wrapped the shackle back around the pages and pushed the whole bundle into the hollow. A slat gave under his hand and he slid the bundle into place. The wind took a name from the stern and threw it overboard. Elias closed the hatch on his hand and let the cold press blood into the pages. He watched the water catch a glint of lantern and then vanish. The ledger slept under rust and brine. Outside, Captain Marlowe stared to the horizon and lifted his spyglass. He did not look back. Elias felt a small, hard shift in himself, from terrified witness to a man who had chosen a methodical shelter for truth. He kept the ledger hidden and wrapped the shackle tight. The ship would continue its work, but Elias now carried a living list under iron. That afternoon, when the crew murmured about a new port and a fresh batch of prisoners, Elias simply breathed and began to plan how to get the ledger ashore. A gull cried and the ship answered with its usual bark of ropes. Elias moved along the wet planks, careful to avoid Marlowe's glanced measure, and pause in the bilge where Thomas had once tapped his shoulder. He allowed, "Not to anyone, I will make them count." His voice was low. The ledger in the shackle made no sound. The sea took another name, and for a moment Elias pictured how the pages might reach a dock clerk with ink and light. Dawn hardened into a pale sheet when Elias rolled the shackle under a sagging board and felt the wood's damp weight close. He wiped his palms on his trousers and looked at the horizon. The ledger lay folded under rust and salt. It would remain there so long as he could keep hands from prying. He did not proclaim victory. He did not make a speech. He found Thomas' scarf folded in a corner and held it against his face, tasting rope and tar and the memory of Thomas' tight squeeze. Elias rose, slow and deliberate, and walked toward the stern where Marlowe stood counting sails. The ledger pressed at his ribs like a small, terrible promise. He would find a way to force the world to remember what the ship erased. At the ship's rail, Elias slid the ledger shackle further under the plank once more, tightened the knot on his bead string, and pressed the broken metal into place. The sea gusted and flung water shards across his boots. A pair of hands bumped his elbow. A deckhand asked if he would stand watch. Elias answered, "Yes, I'll stand watch," and took the watch. He adjusted his shoulders, letting the ledger's weight settle into the habit of his body. The ship creaked, and the crew prepared a new list of names. Elias closed his eyes for one brief breath, and then climbed back to the bilge, keeping the ledger secret in the hollowed iron, where it would not be read without a fight. At dawn, when light finally came full and the hatch opened, Elias crawled into the damp air and found the plank beside the broken shackle empty of Thomas and wet with a single trail of blood. He pressed his palm to the wood and felt the knot's rough edge, then slid the shackle outward and wrapped the ledger to his chest. Thomas was gone. The ledger would now carry both names and obligation. Elias stepped forward, and the crew looked at him without surprise. He met Marlowe's pale blue eyes for a single measured moment, and then turned away, ledger wrapped under iron, and walked toward the wheelhouse, where he would keep watch until a chance to reach land appeared. The ledger rested there like a held breath, and Elias tightened his grip as the deck slatted under his feet. They shoved a new man into the waterlogged hold while Elias pressed the ledger tighter beneath his shirt. Fear sat in Elias's chest like a stone. He counted the knots on the rope instead of speaking. The man hit the wet planks with a sickening thud and cough, and Bosun Reed's boot came down on the man's shoulder. "Quiet, Reed." The hold answered with wet, swallowing silence. Elias knew the stakes. He had heard Captain Marlowe point his brass spyglass at the gangway the night before and say, "One goes tonight." He had watched the man hold in that memory and felt the ledger move against his ribs as if it were the only good thing left on the ship. Within those first breaths in the hold, the central problem became plain. Witnesses vanished, and whoever kept the records could either save names or lose them forever. Elias' fear pushed his hands to steady the ledger. He would keep copying the manifest or die trying. The hold smelled of old tar mold and the copper tang of blood. Lantern light trembled on dripping beams. Elias crouched behind a post and watched Captain Marlowe stand by the hatch, hands in oil-stained gloves, shoulders squared as though cruelty were a routine inspection. Marlowe did not shout. He issued decisions in the small, cold sentences of a man who treated people as movable stock. "Check the names," he said to First Mate Harker. "Keep the list neat." Harker slapped a wet palm on the ledger table midship and shoved a stub of a quill toward Elias. "You copy, Elias." Neat rows, no errors. Elias took the quill with shaking fingers. His hands trembled the way they had when he first saw rope burns form along someone's wrists. The trembling now was fear changing into a methodical focus. He bent his head and began to write. Bosun Reed brought the new prisoner forward by a collar of soaked canvas. The prisoner coughed a water-full cough and spat salt and darkness. Marta, who had been sitting with her back against a barrel, looked up and mouthed the name the man had given before the crew covered his mouth and put a gag in place. Elias heard that name and felt the ledger's pages like a second pulse beneath his palm. Harker spoke low but sharp. Elias, start with the latest manifest. Name, origin, mark. Elias copied the names one by one. The ship's ledger smelled of old glue and damp paper. He noticed needle holes where pages had been stitched back, a clipped corner here, a smear of rust along the margin there. Each flaw felt like a missing tooth in a jaw. Something in the book had been chewed away on purpose. Marta touched Elias's sleeve. Look at the stitch, she whispered. Her voice scraped like sand. See the ink over the seam. That isn't a transfer. That's a discard mark. Elias' hands froze. He lifted his head and peered at the patched portion. The sewn patch bore a tiny, neat letter beneath the thread, an anchor drawn in haste and then crossed out with a rust smear. Elias' suspicion tightened his grip. He slid his thumb along the rust and got a brown stain on his skin. An external clatter interrupted them. Someone above deck dumped a bucket of seawater into the scuppers. The sound ricocheted and forced a reaction from everybody in the hold. Elias's fear shifted to alertness. He folded the ledger closed for a heartbeat, then reopened it to continue copying. The manuscript had names written by different hands. Some entries were clear. Others were half erased or cut away. Every altered line changed what the manifest promised to prove. While Elias copied, Bosun Reed walked the plank and tapped a chain against a beam. Reed, Marta, he marks by smell. Elias looked up. Reed's mouth had a permanent curl that never reached his eyes. Reed leaned over and said, Do your work, Elias. The captain likes neat lists. Reed's voice was small and flat. Elias swallowed and kept writing, but his suspicion turned to a sharper, curdling dread. Midnight weight settled over the crew. Harker produced a roll of paper with names written in a different hand and shoved it at Elias. Add these. They came last from the brig. Don't make mistakes. Elias thumbed the new pages. Several names were followed by blank columns where destinations should be. Elias' fingers hovered. He looked at Harker and found no leniency, only the same administrative calm that had guided the captain. The ledger was becoming evidence and indictment at once. An external event snapped the hold's taut string. A voice above called, Bring her below. Marlowe wants it now. That voice belonged to Reed. For a moment everyone froze. The new man who had been shoved into the hold was pulled up and then dragged back under with new bindings. The crew moved like a single, practiced machine. Elias tried to memorize a name, composition of the bindings, the sound of the man's cough. He burned these observations into his head, because the ledger might not keep them. Harker assigned Elias a task that changed the ledger from a document into a trap. Copy the manifest into this new book and include marks and damages. Harker, we send the new ledger to the quartermaster and keep the other in case of inspection. Elias understood the instruction's shape. One ledger would be visible and polished, the other secret. He realized he was being drawn into the ship's bureaucracy. The ledger in his shirt was now a hidden artifact and a risk that could condemn him if discovered. Elias worked under a hanging lantern that gave off a sputter of yellow light, the kind that made the ink shimmer and then disappear. He copied names in short lines, his script tight. As he wrote, Marta pointed out a torn leaf stitched into the ledger with a different thread. They cut pages and passed them to the sea. She said, They write destinations that don't exist. She tapped Elias' hand and said, You saw the smear. You saw how they hold the last one. Elias nodded and kept his head down. His fear hardened into resolve. He would keep the ledger whole if he could. A discovery shifted the remainder of the night. Elias found a stitched fragment whose handwriting matched Captain Marlowe's angular script. The fragment listed a port with a sea coordinate that did not match the ship's declared route. Elias felt the shift in understanding like a plank slipping under him. He read the coordinate aloud, quiet and fast, 14 degrees west, 32 minutes south, he said. Marta's eyes widened. That is where they dump, not where they send. Elias's certainty moved into a new direction. This was not random cruelty. It was a planned operation. Elias tried to plant a torn leaf under a loose board, while Bosun Reed watched the others above. He worked with his fingernails and a small iron tool he had hidden in his wrap. The wood yielded a thin seam, and the torn leaf, slick with seawater, slipped into the cavity. As he sealed the seam, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Bosun Reed stood over him, the lantern's light cutting hard edges across Reed's cheekbones. "What are you doing, Reed?" Elias stammered. "Die, I was only—" Reed hauled him up by the collar and dragged him before First Mate Harker. Under Harker's examination, Elias felt the ledger rising like a threat to his throat. Harker's questions were quick and practical. "Why hide paper? Who you to?" Elias kept his answers short. Marta, the stitch looked wrong. Harker's face changed for a fraction of a second, then reset. He leaned close to Elias and said, "You know what happens to people who tamper with manifests?" Elias' hands went numb. The emotion in him moved from fear to a brittle, hard patience. He would not confess the ledger's hiding place. Captain Marlowe came down to the hold at pre-dawn. He inspected the ledger fragments with a brass spyglass pressed to one eye, the same way he had pointed it at the gangway. He turned pages with deliberate fingers and tapped a rust smear. They smear to hide the exact time. Marlowe allowed, "We accelerate the clean run." Too many witnesses. First Mate Harker nodded and wrote a new column. Marlowe then issued the order that changed policy into system. "Begin the clean runs at 2 watch. No exceptions." The captain's measured voice ended debate. Harker and Reed exchanged a look that was part relief and part something like triumph. Reed's shoulders lifted in a small, private victory. The knowledge that the act had become official made Elias' stomach drop. The ledger could not survive if the crew ran faster and more often. This new order turned ad hoc punishments into an assembly line. Elias' fear tilted into an acute strategy. He had to move faster than the crew's schedule. They prepared Marta for removal in the pre-dawn storm. The rain came sharp and needle-thin, stinging faces and darkening the deck. Marlowe watched as Marta was chained, the iron biting at her wrists. She nothing. Elias' throat closed. He had seen Marta point out the rust and the stitch earlier. He had seen her eyes flick to the ledger when she thought no one watched. Now she stood with a chain around her and a gaze fixed on the stern. The crew gathered in a methodical line. No one spoke louder than the order. Elias was forced to witness Marta being led to the stern. His hands slipped along the ledger inside his shirt. It felt as if the book were a small animal he could not protect. He tried to step forward and was shoved back by Reed. "Stay where you are, Reed. You will learn nothing by interfering." Marathon sentences of action followed. Men fastened Marta's ankles with rusted links. Someone wrapped a cloth around her mouth. The captain checked the knot twice. The weather made every action more brutal. Rain sluiced over faces and made ropes slick. At the stern, the crew prepared the cast-off. Oldham leaned against a coil of rope and watched with an expression Elias could not read. Oldham had been a presence in the hold for weeks, silent, watchful, and steady. Elias caught Oldham's eye and saw an offer in the older man's posture. Help. Elias made a choice. He would not let Marta or the ledger be erased without an attempt to save at least the record. He nodded once at Oldham. As Marta was forced to her knees, Elias' grip on the ledger loosened. The book slipped out from under his shirt and fell into the puddled planks. A crewman kicked it. For a moment Elias could not move. The ledger lay open and wet, pages flapping. He lunged, but a boot crushed the book and pushed it toward the scupper. Reed laughed. Marlowe's voice cut the sound. "Hold her," he said. "Let the sea do the rest." The crew moved with the efficiency of men who had turned murder into habit. Then something unexpected happened. As the ledger slid toward the scupper, Oldham reached under his coat and tossed a damp, oilcloth bundle across the deck. It wrapped around the ledger and snagged on a nail. The bundle yanked the book from the scupper's pull. Old Thumb cursed and grabbed the seam. "Quick," he hissed to Elias. "Help me." Elias dove, and together they dragged the ledger toward a loose plank in the bilge. The ledger was rescued in a flurry of small, violent movements. Hands digging, splinters, a breath that tasted like rust. The rescue was a minor triumph and a major gamble. Elias and Old Thumb pried a seam in the hull with a hand tool and shoved the ledger into a narrow cavity between the planks. They packed damp cloth and tar to seal it. Elias felt the ledger press against his palm as the seam closed. He spoke once between clenched teeth. "If they find this, we die." Old Thumb did not answer. He sealed the cavity and hammered the plank back into place with blunt, deliberate strikes. The sound of each strike seemed to seal the night's events into the ship's body. Above, the crew executed the cast-off. Marta was dragged to the rail and lashed to a short length of chain. She looked at Elias just before she went quiet. There were no speeches, only a single, sharp breath. Then the captain signaled, and the crew heaved. The chain took Marta's weight, and she slid over the rail. A wet, muffled scream left her mouth and was gone. The sea swallowed the sound. Men turned their faces away as if they had classroom duties to return to. Elias held his breath until the water settled. He felt a new emotion rise, harder to name than fear, a cold, iron resolve that bent his limbs to work. The ledger was buried but not safe. He had learned the captain's coordinates and the pattern of the clean runs. He had seen Harker write columns that masked the true fate of names. He now understood that Marlowe's cruelty was not only punishment but a steady business. The ledger was evidence. It was also a lit fuse. The chapter's twist revealed itself in the bilge. When Elias and Old Thumb opened the ledger to check the positions one last time, they found a sewn fragment that matched Marta's handwriting. Marta had hidden a short note between the pages before she was taken. The note named a shipwright in a port Marlowe visited, and a price the captain had collected to cover the costs of certain disappearances. The note shifted the meaning of many earlier events. This was not only about discipline or fear. It was a trade in silence. Old Thumb swore softly and pressed the note to his chest. Elias read the note twice. The coordinates and names on it matched the rust smear and the stitched patch Elias had seen earlier. The ledger was no longer merely a list of victims. It was a ledger of transactions. Elias's suspicion had turned into clarity. The crew's actions were part of a larger scheme that connected Marlowe with officials ashore. This revelation changed how Elias understood Captain Marlowe's measured cruelty. It was not merely administrative. It was contractual. Dawn came thin and grey. Elias crawled up to the forecastle to watch the indifferent horizon. The ledger lay secreted beneath the hull. He felt its presence as a small, stubborn weight, a fact that resisted the night's erasures. He thought of Marta's eyes and of Old Thumb's hand, heavy and dry. He thought of the man hauled on the gangway the night before, and the brass spyglass that had made him small. The chapter closed with Elias making a concrete decision. He would keep copying, preserve pages, and aim to bring the ledger to shore if he lived. He did not speak that decision aloud. Instead, he tied a thin piece of twine around his wrist and tucked the knot inside his sleeve, a tiny, visible pledge to himself. Then he walked the deck with measured steps and checked the knots on the ropes the way he had counted breaths on the gangway. The ledger would remain hidden for now, and names would remain on its pages. But the ship had changed. Marlowe had converted errant violence into policy, and Elias now carried the knowledge that the crew's disappearances were profit-driven. The chapter ends not with reflection or pledge, but with an action bound to consequence. Elias lifted the lid of the forecastle chest and placed a small carved bone token, his own secret marker, on top of the hidden seam. He closed the chest and latched it tight. The ledger slept in the dark cavity below, and Elias walked back to his place among the prisoners, his shoulders set for the runs that would come at 2 watch. The sea kept moving, indifferent and steady, while a man with a ledger decided to keep a record that others sought to erase. Emotion root. Fear appears early and shapes Ilias' choices. The text shows at least two emotion shifts: suspicion to fear to resolve, then fear to clarity to resolve again, through actions, dialogue, and decisions. The mini cliffhanger occurs when the ledger slips toward the scupper and Old Thumb intervenes. The chapter resolves its immediate conflict. The ledger is hidden and the cast-off occurs. The captain's policy is established, but the ledger survives for now, setting the stakes for what follows. Bosun Reed tore a man's shirt open on the quarterdeck, and a scrap of paper slid across the wet planks. Suspicion tightened Ilias' chest. He kept one hand on his belly, where the ledger sat beneath his shirt, and watched the wind bend the scrap toward Quartermaster Hale. The crew lined the rail and smelled tar and damp wool. Captain Marlowe stood with his brass spyglass at his cheek and said, "Bring every possession forward." The order turned the morning into inspection. Within those first breath, Ilias understood the stakes. If the ledger's mark were recognized, his record would no longer be a secret, but evidence enough to erase him from the ship's ledger and the world beyond. Ilias moved his fingers over the edge of the hidden book without looking down. He had learned to measure time by the creak of ropes and the slap of water against planks. That rhythm told him where the captain's feet would fall, and when a guard would turn his head. He had been hauled up a gangway before and had felt a rope cut into his wrists. He remembered the man who went that night and the way the crew's silence had swallowed his name. That memory of lanterns and a single shouted sentence, "One goes tonight," sat behind his teeth now, and it guided every movement he made on the quarterdeck. Marlowe, Bosun Reed, and the men began a sweep. Bosun Reed held the torn shirt between two fingers like a prize. "What is this?" Reed barked. He dropped the scrap on the planks and leaned in. Quartermaster Hale stooped, ran his thumb along a faded merchant's mark, and said, "That's a Westbury mark. Merchant ledger, perhaps." Ilias' hand tightened. He did not speak. He had two clear choices: draw attention by speaking and risk the ledger being searched openly, or stay quiet and let the captain decide his fate. "Elias," Reed called, and the name rose above the slap of water. The use of Ilias' name stung. Calling a name in that voice was the first step toward public punishment. Ilias kept his jaw slack and moved like a man who has reconciled himself to being watched. He stepped forward when Reed indicated his shirt and pushed his sleeve into place. "Search him," Marlowe in the same measured voice he used when signing manifest entries, and the crew shifted closer. The forced assembly became methodical. Men were made to empty pockets, hand over rosaries, torn beads, and broken writing implements. Mate Hobb stepped between Elias and the rest to act as a buffer, but the buffer was thin. Mate Hobb Elias when Hobb leaned in, his voice low. "If they find any paper," Hobb's fingers closed on Ilias' shoulder. "I know Ilias. Keep still, breathe slow. Let me say nothing." Hobb's reply was a short, clipped instruction rather than a comfort. The limited contact mattered more than any flourish of words. It told Ilias Hobb would act if movement gave him room. Quartermaster Hale called for a closer look at the scrap. He turned it beneath the lantern's glow and traced the merchant's mark with a collused fingertip. "This isn't random. Hale, this ties to port trade records." Who on board would have such a notation? Captain Marlowe's pale blue eyes snapped toward Ilias. "Marlowe, Hale, present it." "Tell me where you found it." Hale's voice did not tremble. He pointed down the gangway toward Bosun Reed, and then to the wet planks where the torn page lay half under a boot heel. Suspicion shifted to Elias as others began to speak. He was seen muttering below deck. One prisoner offered. He kept to corners with a ledger. Another said. The accusations were short sentences, each one a small stone thrown at Ilias. The pattern was familiar: accusation, a name, and then eyes searching for confirmation. Ilias felt fear tighten behind his ribs in a way that slowed his breath. He kept his mouth closed and let Hobb do the talking, Captain Hob, loud enough to be heard. "We had a ledger once." "A ledger tells who paid, who smuggled, who bribed. If that's what it is, that ledger's a danger to us all, but find it fairly." Don T let Reed sue one on a man to climb a rung. Hob's sentence landed like a thrown gauntlet. Reed's jaw clicked. Reed spat. "You re defending him, Hob? Why would you protect a prisoner who keeps a merchant's mark?" Hob answered, "Because I know what Reed will do for favor. Because I know what this ship values more than truth." The exchange pulled attention toward Reed and Hob at once. Quartermaster Hale's examination moved the suspicion from vague to concrete. He recognized a merchant's mark and then matched ink patterns to a common ledger script, an angular hand, a particular ink stain near the top corner. "I've seen this in a manifest out of Westbury. It ties to a merchant named Faversham. This could be contraband lists or sums, maybe payments to someone on shore." The implication moved the problem beyond Elias's personal risk. It suggested that the ship itself had been used in dealings that would ruin Captain Marlowe if exposed. Marrows of tension changed the crew's posture. Men who had been idle reached for tools. Others shifted their feet. Elias's suspicion became fear, and then anger in small toggles. He clenched his fist when Hale turned the scrap in the lantern. He swallowed when a man near the rail called out a name that matched an entry he'd seen in his ledger. He exhaled short when old woman Maris touched his sleeve and passed something small and wet into his palm. He did not look down. He could not afford to lose the ledger now. The captain motioned and called for Elias to be taken below for a private inspection. "Below deck, Marlowe. We will not make a spectacle until I see the full thing." Reed grinned with a humorless mouth. Bosun Reed's fingers closed on Elias's elbow and pulled him toward the narrow hatch. Men crowded the companionway and watched Elias go down. The light narrowed, and the smell of bilge and soaked rope crowded in. In the hold, Elias felt the air change. The light was a single oil lantern on a hook, and the sound was water hitting the planks and men talking low. Old woman Maris pressed against his ribs and hissed, "Wrap the ledger in oilcloth. Hide any mark. When you can, tear the pages out you cannot lose and burn them in the galley when no one sees." Her voice was not a metaphor, but a set of concrete instructions. Elias nodded and kept his face blank. The world below deck required a face that did not flinch. Bosun Reed walked the perimeter like a man making a list. He flipped a wet plank with his boot and found, by contrivance or chance, another scrap. Reed held it up like a verdict, "Found more, Reed," on his route down. On his steps, his statement pushed a new direction to the search. Reed had moved the evidence from the quarterdeck to along Elias's path. That action made the evidence seem linked to Elias's movement. Elias's stomach turned. He heard Hale's mouth close and Marlowe breathe in as if about to sign a log. Elias took one step toward the lantern and said, "Search me. Take everything. I have nothing to hide but this chestash." The phrase fell flat in the damp light. Reed produced a scrap that looked burned at its edge and pressed it to the lantern's glow. The charred corner showed a merchant mark similar to the one Hale had found earlier. Quartermaster Hale leaned in, then stopped. "This mark, Hale, was altered. Someone scorched it to hide a different hand. That's not from Westbury alone. It's a plant." Elias' mind jolted. The thought arrived like a stone struck against a metal rim. The evidence could be fabricated. Elias felt betrayal move through him, first as disbelief, then as a cold certainty. He looked up at Reed. "You planted this, Elias, each word a deliberate shove. You put paper in my path." The accusation hung in the hold, and the lantern showed Reed's mouth as a straight line. Reed's answer came quick and rough. "You re a prisoner? Reed, you think you have rights to accuse a bosun. Hob, Hale, tell me which of you would trust a ledger kept by a prisoner." The hold turned into a ring where men chose sides. 3 rapid exchanges followed. "Reed, did you put those scraps on his steps?" Hob demanded. "No." Reed snapped. "I found them where men pass. I keep an eye on the deck. Don't make us pick between you and a man's life." Hob shot back. Elias, wouldn't he burn his own mark and show it at dawn, would-t he? Reed replied, maybe he wants us to find it. Maybe this ledger is a map to stop us making coin where we must. The back and forth pushed the group's attention outward and forced Captain Marlowe to decide. Marlowe listened and then, with the slow movement of a man who signs ledgers and sentences with the same hand, pronounced a punishment meant to teach. He ordered a ritualized erasure. He will be stripped, lashed, and locked into the shackle cell beneath the bilge until he confesses or the sea takes the truth. Marlowe. The sentence used the exact words of ship discipline and removed any pretense of a private inspection. Elias's breathing shortened. He had expected a search. He had not expected a spectacle designed to break both body and a record. They dragged Elias out to the narrow corridor. Men held torches that threw the lantern light in hard streaks. Bosun Reed barked directions. Quartermaster Hale took the seized pages and kept them near his chest. The movement was efficient. Elias's clothes were pulled away, the rope straps found old scars on his wrists, and lashes were counted. Old woman Maris mouthed something to Hob. Hob answered with a short, sharp nod and then stood aside. Elias's head was pressed against wet wood as the lash cut and his breath came in small, loud pulls. Marlowe watched without display. He had worn his oil-stained coat for years and had the look of a man who had turned cruelty into policy. This is order, Marlowe, when Hale tried to interject. Order keeps the ship afloat. Papers like that burn ships faster than storms. Elias felt rage and a different kind of calculation. Escape was impossible now. He had to survive and find a way to keep the ledger's truth alive. He drew air and coughed with salt water on his tongue. They led him under the main hold and down a set of steps that sloped into darkness. The bilge cell smelled of brine and old bread. A shackle awaited with water pooling at ankle level. Men pushed and locked the iron ring about one wrist and then the other. The cell's iron door groaned. A single lantern swung on a hook and threw an oval of yellow light across Elias's face. Bosun Reed held the seized pages out and fed them to a man with a tin tray and a tin cup of oil. Reed's hand hovered. He did not set the papers aflame himself. He passed them off and watched the small fire begin. Old woman Maris and mate Hob had their own plan. While the crew's eyes were on Elias being shackled, Maris slipped along the wall and Hob moved like a man whose job required quick pockets. They set a small piece of cloth to catch a scorched corner before the flame ate it. The cloth sizzled and Hob pinched a charred fragment between thumb and forefinger, hiding it in the fold of his coat. Their movement was precise, quiet, and without flourish. It was an action meant to preserve something that had been declared dead. From inside the cell, Elias heard the paper burn. He heard the crackle and the brief gasp of a man who let go of proof when the captain's will demanded it. Elias felt suffocation not only from water pooling at his calves, but from the knowledge that a ledger, months of names and amounts, might be gone. He pressed his forehead against the cold iron and reached with one hand toward the damp floor where, once, someone had dropped a page and where Maris had stepped. He could not see the fragment Hob carried, but he felt the possibility of survival in the rhythm of their footsteps going away. Elias tried to call out and found words thick with water and salt. Hob, he croaked. Maris. A soldier's boot thudded in answer. Hob's voice returned, a whisper close enough for the lantern to catch his wet breath. Hold on, Elias. We have something. The reply came as a concrete promise, not a vow. It made Elias do the single purposeful thing he still could. Hold the exact memory of the ledger's page in his head, every number and mark, so that if his hands failed him the knowledge might survive him. The captain posted extra watches after the burning. He had men step 3 abreast across the deck and ordered the hatches sealed at night. He quartermaster Hale to check manifests twice and to write any discrepancies in the captain's book. Those were not vague gestures. They were administrative moves that increased the ship's surveillance and reduced any room for covert exchanges. Elias listened to the new patrols and felt the weight of the captain's measures. They were designed to make breathing quiet and movement traceable. Old woman Maris moved with a sudden, focused boldness. She pressed the scorched fragment into the palm of mate Hob and whispered exact instructions on where to hide it on his body for the walk to the galley. Hob nodded and took the fragment as if carrying a piece of a man's name. The fragment smelled of oil and smoke. It had a partial entry with a sequence of numbers and a name that matched one Elias had written in the ledger. That match changed the shape of suspicion back toward the ship's dealings rather than Elias's personal guilt. A mid-chapter surprise arrived when Quartermaster Hale returned to Marlowe with an observation. The burned edges on the page suggested someone had altered the merchant mark to look like a Westbury hand, but the ink beneath the scorch matched a handwriting used by a petty clerk who had worked under Marlowe years earlier. Hale allowed this doesn't point to him alone. It points to someone who had access to the captain's records at the time. The room tightened. Elias realized the twist. The planted evidence could point outward to the captain's network, and the planted mark might be intended to lead to a scapegoat. Elias' fear shifted into a new form. He recognized that revealing the ledger's truth might topple more than one man. That discovery altered several men's choices. Bosun Reed hardened his posture. He had until then acted like a man building a ladder of favor. Hob moved his feet as if placing them for a long step. Maris' hand smoothed her skirt, and she pretended to be a woman concerned for her joints, but she had the fragment in the fold of her sleeve. Elias from the shackle cell felt a small relief and a larger dread. If the ledger implicated the captain or his near men, then Marlowe's response would become ruthless and administrative in equal measure. Hours passed in measured beats of watch calls and the slap of the sea. Elias' wrists ached where rope had cut old skin. He focused on the fragment he could no longer see by reconstructing entries aloud in the small roar of his head. Names, amounts, wrote notations. He repeated them to himself like a man counting knots. He did not invent numbers. He recited what he had seen. That recital served two purposes. It kept his mind precise, and it created a list he could later compare to Hobbs' fragment. An outside event came like a strike. A small skiff appeared off the lee side of the ship in late afternoon, bringing a man in a wet coat with a message for Captain Marlowe. The arrival interrupted the night's pattern and forced Marlowe to the rail. The man brought a note sealed with the signet of a merchant and spoke of missing payments and a complaint that cargo had been diverted. The message pushed immediate business onto the deck and forced men to reenact the captain's authority in front of a new witness. Elias heard the captain's voice rise to a level where it cracked only once, then steadied. The new arrival gave Marlowe a reason to tighten security further. That evening, while the lantern burned low, old woman Maris and mate Hob sat in a shadowed corner of the galley with the scorched fragment between them. Hob traced the numbers with a finger and read aloud. Faversham, 30, £8, wrote 3 north, on the back. A delivery to Havisham stock. Maris folded her hands and said, "We carry this to shore, Hob, when we can. We keep this hidden until the opportunity to show it to someone off the ship arises." Hob answered, "We will risk it. I will carry it to the market if the captain ever docks near a port with a magistrate willing to look." Their plan was small, specific, and dangerous. Elias listened from below and felt a sliver of the ledger's truth remain. He also understood the consequence. Their plan required a dock and a man willing to defy a captain's order. That need changed his calculations. He had to survive not only the bilge but the captain's next decisions. He held his breath as men paced above and later as footsteps returned to the hatch. Every return of boots was news. Each set of footsteps could carry triumph or a sentence. The crew's demeanor shifted over the next day. Some men kept their heads down and avoided looking at Elias when they passed his hatch. Reed walked with a sharper step and barked about chores. Quartermaster Hale kept his ledger and his eyes in different places, as if the weight of knowledge had moved behind his ribs. Elias saw these changes in movement and used them as a map of where danger and help might be. He learned to read the crew like a set of hands moving across rope. Near dusk, Captain Marlowe stood at the quarterdeck with his brass spyglass and studied the horizon. He called in Reed and Hale and wrote new entries in his small book. Then, in front of the entire crew, he posted extra watches and called for strict checks at each watch relief. No one moves below deck without a written pass. Marlowe read aloud, "No private meetings under lantern light." He signed with a rusted signet ring, and the band left an oval mark in the wax. The measure tightened the ship's routines and made smuggling harder, but it also made taking a fragment ashore more difficult. Elias felt despair and a new determination toggle inside him. Despair because the captain had reduced chances to smuggle proof away. Determination because the fragments saved by Hobb and Maris meant someone off the ship could be shown the ledger's contents if they could reach a port or an alley. Elias turned his head and spat into the damp water pooling under his feet. He did not promise rebellion. He promised himself to remember each line and to survive until Hobb could act. The chapter closed with small, decisive movements. Old woman Maris stitched a scrap of cloth into the cuff of mate Hobb's sleeve and discreetly tied one corner of the scorched fragment into it. Hobb felt the paper's brittle edge with his thumb and said nothing. Captain Marlowe walked past the galley and posted an extra watch list on the bulkhead. Elias listened as the name Hobb passed under the captain's lips when he read the new rotations. The naming connected Hobb to a duty that would take him near shore when the captain called a resupply at the next harbor. In the final instant before the lantern was snuffed for the night, Elias forced his eyes open and said the ledger lines aloud in a whisper that could not be heard above the deck. Names, sums, rotes, and a merchant cess name. He recited them to fix them in his throat. Mate Hobb, with Maris as signal, tucked the scorched fragment deeper and rose. He stepped toward the ladder and past the lantern's pool of light. The last sentence of the chapter is a simple, concrete movement. Mate Hobb folded the scorched fragment into his palm and stepped away from the lantern's circle. A wet bundle sailed across the deck and struck the stern rail before anyone could catch it. The bundle split open where Quartermaster Hale's hand hit it. Paper-soaked, ink bleeding, names visible in ragged strokes. Fear sat in Elias like a lodged pebble. He pressed his fingers to his shirt where the ledger still hid and watched the scrap unfurl. The central problem hung in the open air. Keep the ledger intact, or let the names be buried at sea. From the first instant Elias acted because fear governed the choice before him. He had to decide whether to protect the ledger or let it die with the ship. Elias moved like a man conserving every breath. He had fewer options than he listed in his head. He slipped closer to the rail while crewmen clustered under the lantern, faces wet from rain and sea spray. The captain watched from a step above, spyglass unused in his hand, but eyes cutting the deck with the same measured cruelty Elias had seen since the first night. The opening sequence recalled the day on the gangway when a man had been hauled up and the captain had pointed with his brass spyglass. Elias heard the echo of that earlier command in the captain's voice now. Short, deliberate, final. He remembered counting breaths that night instead of names. Counting kept his hands steady. Now the ledger itself threatened to convert memory into proof, and fear shifted toward a new shape. The ledger could destroy men ashore as well as afloat. Quartermaster Hale crouched and flattened his palm against the wet pages, eyes scanning. He did not speak at once. The lookout, a boy whose teeth had not yet worn, stood near the mast and kept his hand on a loose coil of rope. They became, by small gestures, conspirators. Elias knew he would not have chosen Hale in a safer world, but he recognized the same worn resolve in the quartermaster's stance. Hale Elias, low and deliberate, keep it. Now, Elias, give it here, Hale answered, voice cracked from cold. The quartermaster's hands moved, neither quick nor clumsy. He slid the ledger under his coat and tucked it against his chest like contraband. The movement made Reed shift his weight, and Bosun Reed noticed. Reed's boot hit the planks and his voice cut the small conspiracy. "What are you doing with that rag?" he barked. Reed's hand found Elias's shoulder and shoved. Elias's fingers clenched under his shirt and felt the ledger's corner like a soaked tooth. The push turned private danger into public peril. The crew turned. The lantern threw faces into gold and shadow. The risk increased in heartbeat steps. Bosun Reed grabbed Hale and hauled him into the light. "Hale! You traitor!" Reed spat the word as if it were a physical thing. Quartermaster Hale pulled the ledger free with both hands and slammed it onto the deck. Pages fanned like broken sails, water drawing black lines through names. The men bent to read. The ledger's revelation supplied a new, larger danger. Merchant names, officer names, a list that tied promises of profit to systematic eradication. The ledger no longer belonged to Elias as a personal record. It had become evidence that could ruin patrons and pierce protection. A murmur spread across the deck. "Who's on that list?" someone asked. A hand pointed to a name and then another. Voices rose, clipped with disbelief and greed. The ledger converted whispers into plans. Some men glared toward the captain. Others glanced toward their coin purses. Suddenly the crew's loyalty divided along lines that had nothing to do with the sea and everything to do with survival. Captain Marlowe stepped forward. He did not shout. He cleared his throat and spoke with the same measured tone he used for inspection. "What is this?" he asked. His face remained narrow, the deep vertical scar on his left cheek catching the lantern light. The spyglass hung from his wrist like a threat. Hale answered first. "Names, captain, merchants and officers. They ordered disappearances." "This proves it." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "Hand it here." Now there was a silence that was not empty. It waited for the ledger to change hands and for consequence to take a shape. Elias stepped forward and put both hands on the deck. He felt the wet planks sink beneath him. He did not speak at once. Fear shifted into something more precise. Calculation. Elias had not planned a public handoff. He had rehearsed a transfer beneath the rail, a quiet passing to Quartermaster Hale with a lookout on watch. The attempt to hand the ledger away was meant to preserve names, not expose them. Now the ledger lay like a wound on the deck, and every man who read it could act. The stakes had widened from one life to the entire ship's fate. The captain's face did not change much, but his fingers tightened on the spyglass. He reached for the ledger. Hale blocked him with a forum. "Not yet, Hale. We must decide what we do with this." Marlowe's reply was a statement, not a question. "We bury it. We sink it. We leave nothing." That choice stripped any illusion of rule by law from the conversation. The captain proposed erasure. Hale proposed deliberation. The crew split into factions by the speed of their own fear. A young sailor at the mast muttered, "Sink it and we'll be questioned." Names float. Bosun Reed slammed his palm on the deck, then sinked the witnesses. Simple voices clashed into a pause. Elias moved his hands out from under his shirt and let them shake. He felt the ledger's wet edge press his ribs. He could not tell whether the trembling came from cold or from some deeper response to the ledger's power. Emotion shifted again. Fear gave way to a brittle resolve. He would not let names be buried without a struggle. Elias stepped close to Hale and whispered, "If they sink it, nothing leaves this ship. We need witnesses ashore." Hale's mouth formed a small line. "I know a man on shore," he said, "a clerk with a conscience. I can hand a page to him if we reach port." But if Marlowe moves first, Hale did not finish. The unsaid ended in the heightening wind. The push from Reed turned urgent. Reed grabbed a coil of rope and indicated the rigging. "Cut the rigging," he said to the closest sailors. "Cut it so the captain can set her adrift. If he wants to bury evidence, we make sure he can sail out to sea with it." A group of hands moved toward the rope. The young lookout nodded and stepped forward. The first external action since the ledger's fall rippled outward. an attempted sabotage. This was the first deliberate escalation beyond argument. Marlowe's face grew harder. He barked, "You cut rigging and you die. Do you understand me?" The young sailor answered short. "We are not his graves." 3 rapid lines followed as men divided. Reed shouted orders, Hale shouted back. The young sailor cursed. The exchange contained the exact sharpness required in a confrontation. Names used, threats given, decisions tested. Each line ended in an action. The men began to move. The young sailor knelt and drew a knife across a rope with shallow, precise cuts. Elias saw the motion and thought of the night when the new man hit the wet planks and Bosun Reed's boot came down on his shoulder. That memory anchored Elias' choice. He would not let more men be shoved to die so names could be hidden. Reed lunged to stop the cutting. The mast shook under his weight, and the lantern swung. Sparks of oil flared in the wick, and the light threw different shadows across faces. Reed and the young sailor traded blows fast, raw, and dirty. They exchanged 3 to 5 quick lines of shouting that were all commands and curses and names. "Reed! Cut it! You traitor! Hold the line!" "Hale! Help!" The rapid back and forth resembled a short argument turned physical. Elias grabbed a cleat and threw his full weight. He moved to separate them and to pull the ledger back from the center of the fight. He could feel the ship's rhythm change. Men now acted to gain control or to escape it. A prisoner below began to pound on the hatch. The sound was a new intrusion, a demand from below deck that reminded everyone of the hold full of men who could be shoved into the sea. An alarmed shout came from the quarterdeck. "Prisoners are rising." Someone cried. That external event multiplied urgency. Marlowe swore, then made a single rapid decision. He strode to the rail and pointed. "Bring him here," he said. "Elias, bring him here. If names matter more than order, then order will be the example." Hale tried to shield Elias. "No, Captain," he started. Marlowe did not wait. He seized Elias roughly by the collar and hauled him toward the rail. Elias felt the spyglass graze his coat and the brass keyring at Marlowe's side jingle like small metal screams. At the rail, Marlowe held Elias out and looked at him. "You authored this." Marlowe, voice flat. Elias answered, simple. "I kept a record." Marlowe stared and then spat. "Then the sea will decide whether your record matters." He reached to push Elias over. The storm that had been gathering in the distance reached the ship in a thin line of rain and spray. Bosun Reed lunged. The deck turned into a contest of purchase and weight. Reed's arms closed on Marlowe's sleeve. Hale shoved against Reed. For a moment nothing moved but hands. The ledger lay between them like a coin dropped on a table everyone tried to claim. Then Marlowe twisted. His foot slipped on the wet wood. Reed screamed. Hale pulled backward. The captain pitched forward over the rail. A chunk of rope snapped. A lantern jarred and flames flared. The ledger flew from Hale's hands. Elias reached and caught half of the torn spine. The other half slid from Reed's fingers and arse toward black water. Time narrowed to 2 images. Marlowe's coat disappearing beneath the spray and Elias' hand clenched on the ledger fragment, rain and blood mixing on the pages. For a few seconds, sound compressed into a single long note. The thud of waves, a sailor's cry, the distant crack of a mast. Then the crew reacted. Some dropped to the rail and leaned out to look for Marlowe. Others began dragging ropes to lash the ship steady. The prisoners below beat on their hatch in a desperate chorus. Hale staggered and came to Elias, hands trembling. Hale's voice was small. "I saw his ring," he said. "I saw his signet. He went with his ring. If he sinks, he'll take a patron with him. If he lives," Elias opened his mouth and closed it. He could feel blood under his nails where the ledger had torn him. The pages stuck to his palm. He tasted metal on his tongue and knew he had been cut. At dawn the deck listed, and the storm eased into a sullen rain. Men moved to rescue those shoved or to salvage the ledger. They worked with the mechanical motions of people answering orders. Elias sat against the rail with a wet fragment in his hands. He counted names aloud to himself. Each name sounded like a wound and like a summons. The immediate crisis had resolved into a different problem. Who would carry the ledger to shore and to the clerk Hale named? The captain's absence left a power vacuum that elbowed men into choices. Reed argued for sinking the ship. The young sailor argued to put into the nearest harbor. Hale argued for delivering evidence ashore to a clerk he trusted. Elias found his voice and spoke, his words short and firm. We go to port. Hale, you carry the ledger when we land. The clerk waits. We give him proof. Reed's reply came with a clipped laugh. And what then? You think courts will take battered pages? You think merchants want to pay men to disappear the clerk? Hale answered, quiet but steady, we have names now. Men ashore will read them, they will ask. They will not let it pass. We will deliver it. The exchange revealed another emotion shift inside Elias, from fear into a stubborn insistence that proof matter. He no longer moved only to preserve himself, he moved to preserve record and to exact a kind of public reckoning. The captain's body washed up 3 days later, tangled in a length of sail. The men found the signet ring had been torn from his finger. Reed held it up and sneered. Found our ruler's seal, he said. He left orders. Now we choose. Some men wanted to bind the ledger in oilcloth and toss it to the shore with a note. Others wanted to burn what remained and forget. Quartermaster Hale gathered survivors and read names aloud while the ship drifted toward harbor. The act of reading forced men to reckon with authors and offenders. When the vessel finally threaded into a sheltered cove, someone onshore spotted smoke and sent a small boat. The clerk Hale had named waited at the quay with his satchel and a hired lantern. He took the wet fragment with hands that shook but did not let it slip. He read in the lamplight for hours while Elias stood in the rain and watched the harbor men move. The clerk promised to make copies and to seek testimony. Before they disembarked, the crew argued about how to tell the tale. Reed wanted to depict Marlowe as lost to weather and accident. Hale insisted on truth. Elias stepped between two men and said, simply, truth is safer than silence now. Reed spat on the deck. You and your ledger will make enemies, Elias replied. Tight. Then let them come. Names are names. They will follow men ashore. They cannot drown with the tide if we hand them over. The statement was not rhetorical. Elias felt resolve that bordered on exhaustion. He had become the ledger's guardian by weight of memory and by the cost he had already paid. At the quay the clerk read pages under lamplight. The ink ran in places, but enough letters remained to tie certain men on shore to payments and orders. The clerk wrote copies and made notes in a slow official hand. He Elias and Hale to rest while he moved to find a magistrate. Come with me, the clerk said. We must make an affidavit. Elias looked at Hale. Hale's face carried the scar of the night's struggles and a thin, resolute line at his mouth. He nodded. We follow, Hale. In the magistrate's office, official dumbs and a table scarred by ink and stamps felt like a new kind of lantern. The magistrate read and tapped fingers. He pointed questions about dates and places and payments. Elias answered in short, factual bursts. Hale supplemented names and shipments. Reed, called in as a witness by the magistrate, shifted stories 3 times before he settled on a version that left his own culpability ambiguous, but pointed toward Marlowe's scheme. A small legal action followed. Arrests were made not only among lower men, but eventually at the merchant house that had funded the eradication policy. The men who came ashore to meet with police were shocked to find their patrons under scrutiny. Names that had been on the ledger circulated in rooms with accounts and receipts. The ledger had done what Elias had wanted. It had moved the crime from the deck to a desk, from the wave to a court. Yet consequence had a cost. Reed escaped formal punishment by sailing on another ship before records could bind him. The young sailor received a small stipend and quiet shelter. He would live with the memory of a hand on a rope and the taste of cold salt. Hale testified in a hearing and later fell ill. His lungs never recovered from the damp hold. Elias lived but carried rope scars and a ledger fragment that smelled of brine and iron. The lives of the crew splintered along paths made by the ledger's exposure. Elias insisted on one last action before he dispersed. He delivered the ledger fragment to a small meeting of survivors and witnesses. He named men and dates aloud. He let the clerk copy the handwriting into court records. Each name taken from the water reenacted a past that had tried to be unmade. Men listened and some wept. Others slammed their fists on the table. The testimony changed how those present saw their own choices. It forced the young sailor to hold his head up and to say aloud what he had done. It forced Reed to avoid meeting eyes. In the weeks that followed, inquiries reached distant ports. A few arrests occurred. Lawyers argued contracts and the limits of maritime law. Some patrons escaped prosecution on technicalities. Justice did not equal vengeance. Elias learned that proofs can be imperfect and that naming wrongs rarely repairs damaged bodies. Still, the ledger ensured that erasure had not been absolute. Elias's final conversation with Hale took place at the quay where they had first met the clerk. Hale's hands were rough and primed with small, accidental cuts. "You saved names, Hale. You made me do something I had not the courage for before." Elias looked at the ledger's fragment in Hale's palm and said, quietly, "You kept it when it mattered." "That will have to be enough." Hale nodded and then asked, practical, "What will you do now?" Elias answered in a spare, factual way, "I will give testimony when I am needed. I will keep the memory. I will not make more graves." Hale placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, "Then go. Find dry cloth and rest." The Sea Marksmen for a long time. Elias left the quay with a small satchel, the ledger fragment wrapped in oilcloth, and a body that would not forget how men traded lives for coin. He had not found absolution. He had found procedure. 2 months later, a public notice recorded an inquiry and a partial recompense to families of some men lost. The clerk sent Elias a letter noting that some merchant partners had been defrocked from certain guilds and others blacklisted. Elias kept the letter in his coat and read it when the night was cold. He rubbed his scarred wrists with fingers that still trembled when he slept near water. The ship that had been the torture chamber was sold for scrap. Boatswain Reed's name survived in rumor and accusation. Quartermaster Hale traveled to another port and found work in an honest ledger maker's shop until his cuff finally took him. The young sailor married and kept his hands off ropes in storms. Elias learned to stand in harbors without flinching at the roll of a ship and to speak names when asked. The ledger's fragment lived in a magistrate's box and in 2 copies held by clerks who vowed to protect them. The final paragraph of the chapter closes on a concrete beat. Elias, at dawn, stands at the quay with the last wet page folded into a small, oilcloth bundle. And he hands that bundle to a clerk who shuts it inside a wooden chest and seals it with wax while rain still runs from his sleeve. Elias watched the clerk press the seal down and then say, "We will keep this safe." Elias answered short, "Keep it safe for those who cannot speak." The clerk nodded and locked the chest. And Elias walked away with his hands empty and the ledger's names now lodged in other hands and in official ink.